Hello, everyone, from a bright and sunny Toronto in Canada. And thank you to ISACA Lisbon and to the organizing committee for hosting this conference. My talk today is on culture and ethics as drivers of IT governance effectiveness. And you'll notice the choice of word, effectiveness. So what I'm speaking here about is about doing the right things rather than doing the things right, which is an efficiency conversation. But with that said, let's go straight into the presentation. So the first thing, scandal. And you might think, well, what has scandal got to do with IT governance? Well, what's interesting is if you look at the definition of the word scandal, it is behavior that people think is morally or legally wrong and that causes public feelings of shock or anger. Now, the behavior part is the cultural thing. So culture is about norms and behaviors. And ethics is about the sense of wrongness or rightness of something. So immediately you might think, okay, so what has this got to do with IT? And that's exactly what this presentation is about. We're going to highlight IT issues that cause scandal, either through behavioral issues or cultural issues, or through ethical issues, things about being right or wrong. And we'll see what we can do about it to try, or what IT governance can do to prevent these kind of things happening within our environment. So the first thing, culture. You might think, culture doesn't really matter. I mean, why does this matter to IT? One of the most important things is that if we look at an example on the left there, there's so many different examples of cultural failures that caused embarrassment, that caused reputation risk, it caused financial penalties. And one of the biggest things is that culture is often seen as a company's most precious asset. But as we will see later in this presentation, culture can quickly become its greatest liability, and in particular, how culture constrains the strategy of an organization. As IT governance professionals, you know that one of the most important things is to ensure the alignment of IT with strategy. So if culture is getting in the way of strategy, and IT is trying to align with the strategy it thinks where the organization is going, you can see there's going to be a little bit of a mismatch. From an ethical perspective, so this is quite interesting, is from the point of view of breaches. So here we've got two credit bureau. Both of them experienced data breaches, Equifax in 2017 and Experian in May 2020. What is interesting is the amount of time it took both of these organizations to report the data breach. In the case of Equifax, around about 3 months. In the case of Experian, around about 1 month. And you'd say, well, why is this important? Why is this an ethical issue? Well, think about it this way. If you were the subject of the data breach, you'd want to know straight away that your data has been compromised. And in fact, that's exactly why the GDPR requires notification to everyone affected by a breach within 72 hours of discovery. Not weeks, not months, or in another example, not years, but 72 hours. So that's a brief summary or just a brief introduction around culture and ethics. Let's have a look and explore this in a little bit more detail. Just so that everyone's on the same page, what do we mean by IT governance? Well, it's basically ensuring that IT creates the value expected of it. If IT does not create value for the organization, that IT is redundant. Certainly, whether it's infrastructural, whether it's application, or whether it's in the data space, all of these investments need to create some kind of value for the organization. And it's the role of the IT governance professional to ensure that these IT investments do actually create value. As a matter of interesting, in terms of the pillars of IT governance, strategic alignment, risk, financials or benefits, and resourcing, culture and ethics make up the resourcing pillar of the enterprise governance of IT. What about culture? Lots of different types in organizations. An organization can be very stable, things don't change very quickly, can be very hierarchical, very control-based. It can be internally focused, can be externally focused on the market. It can be focused on flexibility versus control. or it can be focused on stability versus the freedom of employees to act. It can be about integration or differentiation. And just as some examples here, I mean, McDonald's is your typical hierarchical type of organization. And then on the other hand, we have organizations like IKEA, which have a very collaborative family type of environment. And as we look on the other side of the table, you've got organizations like Facebook, which is all about finding new ways to monetize data and opportunities to increasingly monetize data. So folks are encouraged to come forward with innovative means to monetize data. And on the other hand, you've got the whole competitive sphere where organizations like Philips in Holland, all about bringing new products to markets in order to compete and to differentiate from their competitors. What is really interesting and what maybe many don't know is that culture is the single greatest IT risk. In particular, the kinds of things that you see exhibited through culture are when employees are detached from the environment, or they're in denial about change, or there's a lot of ambiguity going on in the organization under change, or folks are avoiding change. These are all typical behaviors that result in risk in the IT kinds of space. And this is why one of the key things that we'd get to later in the presentation, what can we do to ensure that culture is appropriately managed, that the risk of culture is not as high as it would otherwise be, to ensure appropriate IT outcomes. Ethics as well, lots of different models for ethics. Here's one particular example, and you will notice I've got sources at the bottom of many of these slides. Feel free to go and look at them in further detail. But from an ethics perspective, if I had to ask somebody in the audience, do you work for an ethical organization? You might say, yeah, sure. We comply with all laws, we comply with all professional codes. So yes, we're ethical. And there's lots of different models. There's models that have got very strong personalities that drive not only the behavior and the culture within the organization, but that self-interest of individuals could really begin to constrain ethical issues and just about everything in between. So lots of different models, but this is just one of them. But what does this all mean? Just as we saw earlier, how culture could possibly be a constraint to strategy execution, the same thing happens with ethics. You could be responsible potentially for criminal behavior. You could be engaging with a client. Let's say you're in phones or laptops, and a client brings your laptop in for a service, and you look at it and say, nope, we can't fix this. You've got to buy a new one, when indeed the thing could have been fixed, but the organization is looking for greater revenue stream rather in terms of the client buying a new laptop rather than spending all of the time to actually repair it. And of course, these kinds of ethical behaviors result in reputation risk, potentially legal action against the organization. And both of these have both direct and indirect financial impacts on the organization. So culture can constrain strategy, ethics can constrain all sorts of behaviors and open the can towards reputation risk, legal risk, and financial impact. It's really important to keep an eye on both of these things. So you might ask, guys, so is this really a problem? What are you talking about? Is this meaningful? Well, let's have a look at some examples. So on this page, from an IT governance perspective, the Royal Bank of Scotland was fined $10 million by the UK financial regulator for poor IT governance. That's one example. As I said, you do the homework, you'll find many examples where organizations have been fined for poor IT governance. Not no IT governance, poor IT governance. You've got Volkswagen. We all know about the diesel emission scandal, where technology was used to, during testing, give Volkswagen diesel passenger vehicles the feel of better fuel economy than they would actually realize in real life. And before anyone says, why are you looking at my country? Let me tell you about my own country, Canada. There was the Phoenix system, which is a payroll system for the entire country, which was budgeted to cost around about $200 million to complete. but instead will cost 1.7 billion US dollars to complete by 2023. And the cultural issue raised here was the Auditor General of Canada, which is the highest auditing body in Canada, found that the cultural problem was a public service, a government service that was fearful of communicating failures to superiors. That's one set of examples. Let's have a look at some more. Uber, chief security officer, allegedly covered up a data breach for a year, right? That is a poor ethical example. Ford, in IT governance, they spent 400 million US dollars on a procurement system. It didn't work. So what did they do? They didn't roll forward. They rolled backwards to older technologies. Everyone here will know about Theranos, that quick blood testing startup that was once valued at 9 billion US dollars, was absolutely fake and was one of the biggest fraudulent organizations in history from a startup perspective. And this technology organization under Elizabeth Holmes had the culture of fake it until you make it. Unfortunately, it was all fake. There was a whistleblower. They were found out, and Theranos no longer exists today. Like I said, from a case where it was once worth 9 billion US dollars. Lots of examples. You can do the homework, whether it's ethical failures from a technology perspective, cultural failures, or failures in IT governance. These are all over the place. They're all over the news. So what do we do about it? So the important thing is that the enterprise governance of IT, with an appropriate mandate, can help immunize against scandal and reputation risk. How can it do this? Well, let's have a look at some things. Let's have a look and see how these things intersect. So the first thing to be aware of is that probably every organization has got some sense of failures at the intersection of IT governance, culture, and ethics. How many times have you heard your boss say, "I don't care how you get it done, just get it done"? Okay, that's a problem, especially if you start crossing the line of ethics. How many times have you realized that bonuses get paid, for sure, with success, but there's no penalties being extracted for either business units or people that might have been unethical in the achievement of the organization's outcomes? How many times have you worked in organizations where within the team, you realize it's much more important to fit in the team than to do the right thing? And in fact, if you do see something that you're not happy with in the organization, your peer group might come to you and say, "Yeah, you're going to report this, but what will you gain through speaking up? You could be putting your career at risk. All sorts of things could be happening." So certainly, if we bring all of these three things together, lots of problem areas. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail what's going on inside all of this. What we're really aiming for at the intersection of IT governance, culture, and ethics is that the organization creates IT value under the stewardship of IT governance professionals while behaving respectfully of all stakeholders, both internal to the organization, like employees, and external to the organization, whether they're clients, whether it's creditors, whether it's shareholders, whether it's the board, and ensuring that they do the right things in terms of how the world sees things. So how do we get there? Let's bring it all together. So one of the most important things about IT governance, and I don't think many of our peer group as IT governance professionals realize this, but being an IT governance professional is a huge fiduciary responsibility. What is fiduciary responsibility? Well, that is about ensuring trust and ensuring that our activities are performed in good faith. How do we do that? We do that by ensuring, as we saw earlier, that technology-driven value is created while behaving respectfully of all stakeholders. You might say, but why is it about trust? So think about the case of Volkswagen. You go out, you want to buy a Volkswagen Golf or a Volkswagen Passat. You trust that the organization has built a solid car, that it's reliable, that all of the statistics you see about the car are trustworthy. And then you go out and you buy the car only to discover, my golly, this car doesn't do what the manufacturer said. And in this case, this car is not achieving the kinds of fuel consumption that the manufacturer said. So in this respect, from an IT perspective, from, let's say, within Volkswagen, there is a fiduciary responsibility of everyone in IT, particularly your IT governance professionals, to ensure that the qualities of good faith and of trust are maintained by means of this activity. The same holds for data. Data is also fiduciary responsibility. You could be providing the wrong data to management to make decisions on, but you don't even know the quality of the data, and management makes a decision and finds it's the wrong decision, but the quality of the data was wrong. In other words, even from a data governance perspective, there's a fiduciary responsibility, and this rests heavily on our shoulders as IT governance professionals. We saw earlier that culture is the greatest IT risk. So we spoke a little bit about whistleblowing when we spoke about Theranos, but notice how culture can constrain and why culture is one of the greatest IT risks. Half of respondents to a survey had information about organizational misconduct. Half of them said they faced pressure to withhold the information. Half of them were concerned about their career. What would happen to their career if they reported the misconduct? Half of them actually feared for their personal safety if they reported anything. So it's one thing to say, yes, our organization, it's great. It's got a whistleblower policy, so we're all acting ethically. But if the culture of the organization is such that no one actually wants to be a whistleblower in the case of having identified misconduct, there's a problem. So what do we find? We find that, okay, if culture is the greatest single risk to successful IT, and if culture can constrain IT ethics, in other words, behaving ethically, like whistleblowing, then it is absolutely imperative to drive the right culture to help ensure that the required IT outcomes do not have the potential for scandal. So there's almost a direction of causality here. Culture drives ethics. We've seen culture drives IT governance, and both of these things are needed to be sure that as IT governance professionals, we ensure that IT produces ethical value for all of its stakeholders. So what kinds of things then can we do? What kind of things can we do to ensure that, or kinds of things we should note when we're trying to effect culture change, when we're trying to make a culture change? So the first thing, communication. It's why are you changing, or what are you planning to do that's different? Why is it so important to be changing? What was the problem? I mean, there's no point changing just for change's sake. Identify the problem and take your staff through the journey of why this change is coming. Another important thing, I'll get your role models in a moment, is training, to be sure that as things change, that there's appropriate training for the workforce to be doing things differently in the organization, to be behaving differently in the organization. But two of the biggest things are role models and reinforcement. If senior leadership are not setting the example by behavior, not by words, by behavior, you're going to have a problem with culture change. And we've all seen, for those of us that work in banking, the FSB, the Financial Services Board, speaks about risk culture being the tone from the top, and the tone from the top starts with the board. Good role models are really important to effect culture change. And then there's reinforcement. When the organization sees that staff are acting in behaviors that are putting into effect the changes in behavior required, reinforce it. It could be with financial rewards, it could be with non-financial rewards, but certainly these are the four biggest things you can do to help effect culture change in an organization. In closing, as we start getting to the end of the presentation, you've learned through this presentation that behavior and wrongness, or ethics and culture, can comprise not only IT, but it can compromise the entire organization's reputation. Most important point, as IT governance professionals, we carry a heavy burden on our shoulders. The fiduciary duty to ensure that the organization's IT ethics and IT culture don't compromise either the strategy of the organization or compromise the entire organization. We also saw IT culture is at the root of strategically aligned IT value creation. We saw that IT culture is at the heart of IT whistleblowing effectiveness. If there's a culture that feels, no, don't report, you're going to get into trouble, there's no point having any whistleblowing procedures and policies, which is an ethical consideration. And we also saw how poor IT culture is the driver of poor IT ethics, which is why we start with culture when we want to be ensure that ethics are in place to ensure that the IT that we as IT governance professionals that we are stewards of creates the value expected of it in an ethically sound way. My question to you then, in closing, that as IT governance professionals, shouldn't you be well versed in these matters? On that note, I want to say thank you very much again to ISACA Lisbon for hosting me. Thank you to the organizing committee, and of course to our sponsors and IDC for hosting this fabulous session. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the session.